we get those highlights up so we can see the audience that's asking the questions? Okay, that's a little bit better. Look, they're still here. Thank you for your patience. There were a great number of great questions on Twitter and in hard copy, and so we'll get to as many as we can. And I want to follow in the questioning, I think, the same narrative that I followed in the asking, which will begin, I think, with language questions and then move on. Well, let's begin with a Twitter one from Bertie Russell. Some of these Twitter names I can't say in public, actually. Anyway, do you believe that the mind is, in principle, computable, implying that it could be emulated on other substrates in the future? On other substrates, like silicon, I think he's talking about.
As far as, look, the mind is organized matter. It's organized in a particular way which we don't understand, but we don't understand much about bee communication. There's no reason, we don't know of any physical reason to believe that the particular components of that organized matter are critical for its operation. It appears to be something about the way it's organized. That's as far as we know, so therefore it could be emulated, presumably, in some other substances.
Yeah, I mean, as a physicist, I mean, we are a computing machine of some sort, and it happens to be we happen to use a certain system for storing and reproducing, whether it's genetic or electrical. It's hard to imagine that any other system wouldn't. That if we were able to reproduce all that information, we wouldn't get the same person.
But it's one of those cases, as you said before, where you really have to be humble, because so little is understood about it. And the major question, what is the puppeteer doing?
Yeah.
That one we don't even know how to address.
In fact, we should talk about that as one of the things that we didn't talk about, that this emerging notion that many of our conscious decisions are really not conscious. Maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Well, there's there's some experimental evidence by now that when you undertake a voluntary action, like say picking this up, very briefly before you are conscious of making the decision, the parts of your brain that are organizing the action are already active, which means that the decision is made pre-consciously and then reaches consciousness at some point. Most of our decisions never reach consciousness. We're doing all kinds of things all the time and totally unaware of them. And parts of the way we have two brains, remember. There's this one and there's this one, sometimes called the gut brain, the enteric nervous system, which is a real nervous system. It's rich in neurons, it suffers Alzheimer's. It's very similar to this one. And we haven't the slightest consciousness about what it's doing. Unless you get a stomach ache, then you know it's not working properly. But with regard to language, unfortunately, there has been no serious investigation of the question, though it could be investigated. So we're left at the moment with introspection. That's not a good state, but try it. When you introspect about your thinking and language, I think what you find is that the expressions you articulate to yourself, come almost instantaneously, indicating that there was pre-conscious organization of the thought that is sometimes reaching consciousness and often is not. And I suspect that when these topics begin to be investigated, which is not impossible, that's what we're going to discover, that this mystery of what the puppeteer is doing is probably pre-conscious. We will not get access to it through conscious introspection, but only in indirect ways, the way we learn what the enteric nervous system is doing. That's a guess about what will be discovered if these topics are ever investigated seriously. One of the reasons they're not investigated is because of the assumption in modern philosophy, psychology, that consciousness is the hard problem. I don't think that's true. I suspect consciousness is a problem that we know how to address. You know, you can find the mechanisms involved in consciousness. You'll learn a lot about it. Pre-conscious decisioning choices, I suspect, is a much deeper problem.
Okay, well, this is interesting. I mean, we're asked to speculate on things about the future, for which we really, as we should emphasize, about a system that we don't understand much of now. But in that spirit, and following up on this idea that maybe that the brain is a material entity and therefore might be reproduced elsewhere, Bishop has asked, do you think that AI, and this is a really interesting question, I think, do you think that AI will have the same snowflake language apparatus or quick evolutionary moments in regards to creativity and language? Namely, assuming AI becomes conscious, would you imagine it would have the same kind of language development? It's a really speculative question, but it's an interesting one, it seems to me.
Well, first of all, I should be a little cautious about AI. What exactly is it? There's two variants of AI. One is roughly, science and engineering. I mean, it's a rough distinction. There's the kind of AI which is trying to construct devices that are useful, self-driving cars, robots that can clean your house, things like that. That's fine. It's not really contributing, except very indirectly, to the understanding of how cognitive systems, intelligent systems work. It's doing things that are useful, which is fine. It's like building a bigger bulldozer. It's great. There's another kind of AI which is pure science, which is trying to discover the nature of what is going on when a nematode decides to turn to the left, or when I decide to pick this up. But that's the same as, it might be called AI if you like, but it's the same as just science, cognitive science. What will happen if I think the question is asking, what if robots are designed which have the same properties, the mechanisms that we will come to understand are essential for consciousness? Will they be conscious? We can already ask that question about dogs. I mean, are they conscious? In fact, you can ask that question about me. You know you're conscious. Do you know that I'm conscious? No, just because I tell you I am. That doesn't mean anything. The robot could too.
There's the Turing test, which it turns out to be not a very good test, after all.
Well, the Turing test is kind of interesting. Turing himself was a very brilliant mathematician and scientist. He understood that the test didn't amount to much. The history of the Turing test is kind of intriguing. This is based on an 8-page paper around 1950 called Can Machines Think or something. Turing in that paper says, the question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. And he's right. Asking whether machines can think is like asking whether submarines swim. If you want to call that swimming, it's swimming. And in fact, like it takes the airplanes fly. In English, they fly. In Hebrew, they glide. Do people fly? In Japanese, when they're jumping, they fly. In English, they don't. These are terminological questions. What we can do, and Turing, he did suggest this imitation game, but it is not, as he pointed out, an answer to the question whether machines think, because it's not a serious question. The notion thinking isn't well enough defined, so you can ask whether it's being achieved by some device. Now, it's kind of striking that if you go back to the 17th century, the same questions were asked, but as scientific questions. So go back to Descartes, who observed, as far as we know correctly, that this creative aspect of language use is a unique human capacity. Well, that immediately led to experimental proposals. de Cordemois, the minor Cartesians, outlined tests that you could use, a series of experiments that you could use if there was another creature who looked like you and you wanted to find out if he had this capacity. And he pointed out, like a scientist, that if the creature passes all the tests you can think of, then it would be reasonable to assume that he has the capacity. It doesn't prove it, but you don't prove things in science. That was a serious version of the Turing test. It was about something real, namely a capacity that you're trying to test for. It's kind of like a litmus test, you know, for acidity. There's something real, you're trying to find out whether some object has it. That's very different from the Turing test. In fact, in many ways, I think there's been kind of intellectual regression from the 17th century to today, replacing the serious tests about reality, litmus tests for a particular capacity, by a test that's basically like answering the question whether submarines swim. Doesn't mean much more than that.
Let's follow up on that a little, because you know, you talked earlier this evening about the idea that maybe things, whatever it was that initiated the possibility of language, had to be, in a sense, because of the laws of nature. The thing that would be interesting to me is whether, therefore, there is a unique set of cognitive processes. And so it would be interesting if one had machines that think to see if they think differently. I think that would be a fascinating question.
Certainly. We know that there are some that are different. So, for example, an automated procedure for, say, determining whether a paper in the American Mathematical Society gives a real proof. If you look at things that are called proofs, I mean, there are lots of intuition and, you know, appeal to what people know and so on. Yeah. You try to formalize it and fill them in the details, it's pretty hard, but yeah. Sometimes turn out to be very hard. But you can think of automated ways of doing that, which are not the ways we do it.
And as I've said in the stage before, we know that computers think, at least right now, think differently because they use energy in a very vastly different way.
Yeah, they do all kinds of things that we can't do. But
and they also do it much, in some sense, much more inefficiently in terms of energy consumption.
Yeah, but so do cars.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, speaking of language, this is an interesting question from Anna. Do you think language ever limits science? As in, we lack the language or words to effectively communicate scientific ideas? Or do you believe that language enlivens science and makes it more relatable?
Well, what we all know, if you stop to think for a minute, as soon as you start doing scientific work, you depart from language.
Yeah, exactly.
In crucial ways. So, for example, the words of human language, like, say, river or person or tree or whatever you like, they do not pick out mind-independent entities in the external world. For those of you who know philosophical literature, there is no reference or denotation relation in natural language. In science, there is. The goal of science, if you postulate, say, a quark or electron or phoneme or whatever it is, you're hoping that it picks out something that's in the mind external world. You may not achieve it, but that's what you're aiming for. A normative element of science is to create a system that does have literal reference. The symbols pick out something extramental. That's already departing from language. And when you go on, it departs even faster. I mean, science is using, say, mathematics.
Well, I was just going to say, the point, the other aspect of language is, at least in my field, and I think you try to do this in linguistics, is it's clear, for whatever reason, still really not known, that the appropriate language is not any of the languages that we use, but mathematics. Mathematics is and mathematics isn't a language like the other languages. Yeah.
Mathematics is the language of science.
It's a language of science, but it's not a language in the sense of any of the other languages.
It's only a language metaphorically, the way airplanes flying is metaphoric. It's a symbolic system, has some of the properties of natural language, differs in other respects, and it's invented, created to serve a certain purpose. The language isn't created. Human language isn't created. It's there. It's just part of your, if you don't mind, nature.
Okay, now Jesse has asked an interesting question, because of course you related the fact that one of the constraints on understanding language as opposed to seeing is that you can, whether you believe it's ethical or not, and we've had Peter Singer on the stage who'd say it isn't, but with seeing you can do experiments that seem vicious on animals, but you can do them. We say that's ethical. But with language, of course, you can't do experiments in humans. So the question that Jesse's asked, which is an interesting one, is, are ethics more important than further discovery, understanding, and learning? I.e., research, studies, experiments only on animal ethics hinder our study of humans. So,
well, I quickly passed over the question whether torture of cats and monkeys is legitimate.
Yeah.
That's not a trivial question. And in fact, part of the moral advance of the past, say, half century is to impose much stricter regulations on animal experimentation. A lot of things that were being done, say, in the 1950s, that you couldn't do today. I think that's progress. We can ask, is it enough progress? What kind, and in fact, as you know, I mean, recently there have been very stringent constraints on invasive experimentation with chimpanzees. Yeah. And we have to ask, how far does this go? We're kind of expanding our moral horizons over the years, and what is the right direction for them to pursue, to follow? It's not a trivial question. It's related to things like vegetarianism, for example. Is it appropriate for us to murder animals because we want to eat them? You know?
Well, in fact, so in some sense, the answer to the question is that not only is ethics, in some sense, more important, well, not only must we use ethical arguments to constrain the way we do science, but we have to consider the possibility, at least, that we may have to constrain it further. That we may have to constrain it further, that many of the experiments we do...
there's no reason to believe that we've reached the limit of moral perception.
It's interesting that, at least in many areas of the scientific community is self-regulating in terms of ethics, ethical issues. The genetics community in particular has had to deal with, from recombinant DNA onward, and has done a reasonably good job of policing themselves when it comes to those kind of ethical issues. I don't know how generally that expands.
Reasonably good, but there are very unfortunate exceptions.
Yeah.
Take the Tuskegee experiments, for example.
Yeah, exactly, which is a great book about. Okay, we're going to sort of start moving from the language domain to the other domains. Well, let's hit a specific one, right? Well, actually, let me do this. I think it's a young person, Ethan. I don't know if it's a young person, but for an individual, when is it appropriate to transition from remaining objective and trying to resist getting caught up in dogma to committing to a perspective and thus being able to commit to a given cause or way of thinking? So the idea, he asks, is when is it appropriate to sort of take up a cause which he views as non-objective?
There's no algorithm for that. These are individual choices. It's like asking, how should you raise your children? You know, there's no prescription. You can't look it up in a book. All of these things are part of human decisions, human life. We don't understand much about them, but they're the essence of human life. Every moment of life, we're making choices and decisions like that. And how you do it, nobody knows. How you decide to do it, that's up to you. You have to evaluate who you are, what you think your responsibilities are, what serious choices are available to you, how much are you willing to devote to this or that enterprise. These are just personal choices. It's kind of like asking, shall I try to become linguist or a taxidermist.
Well, but at the same time, and I know I've had this debate with a good friend of mine who's in the audience right now. There's this statement, I forget who made it, and you probably know it. You can't go from is to ought, and which I've had repeated to me numerous times. But at the same time, it seems to me that it isn't an all or nothing issue. You don't, by committing to a cause does not mean you've lost objectivity. Many of our decisions are based on rationality.
And on fact.
And facts and evidence. Assessments of facts and evidence. So assessing facts and evidence and determining rational action is by no means equivalent to dogma. And I would argue that most of our ethical and moral decisions that we claim, many of our ethical and moral decisions that we claim might be dogma are really, we hope, based on rationality and evidence. So it isn't an all or nothing situation.
I mean, in life you can't concentrate on every next act and consider the consequences, the externalities, and so on. Otherwise, you'd never walk across the room. You have to focus on the things that seem important. And on those, yes, our best assessment of the facts is always relevant. Humility is always relevant, recognizing maybe our best assessment is wrong. And then comes this unanswerable question of how we decide what to do given what we understand about the facts and the likely consequences of what we do. And as I said, there's no algorithm for that. Okay,
let's go from a vague question to a specific question, or an immediate question. What, in your opinion, would be the best solution for the Palestinian people in regards to civil and human rights? What can we do to bring that about?
Well, actually, that's one of the easier questions in world affairs. There's been an overwhelming international consensus for about 40 years on a short-term settlement for the Israel-Arab conflict. Not forever, nothing's forever, but a way to deal with the immediate problems in a manner which will carry things forward. Now, that's what's called a two-state settlement. Now, that was actually proposed at the United Nations Security Council in January 1976, a long time ago. It was proposed by the three major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. They proposed a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, and we know what that is, with guarantees for the rights of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. I'm virtually quoting. That was January 1976. It was vetoed by the United States. When a resolution is vetoed by the United States, it's typically a double veto. First of all, it isn't implemented. Secondly, it's wiped out of history. So you'll have to look pretty hard even to find a record of this, even in scholarly works on the conflict. It's wiped out of history. The same resolution was advanced by the same states in 1980, vetoed by the United States, out of history. Then comes a long record. I won't run through it. But there's veto after veto. There are General Assembly resolutions, which are, 150 to 3, United States, Israel, Marshall Islands, or something like that. That's been the record for ever since the mid-70s. The most recent U.S. veto actually did get some attention because it was so remarkable. In February 2011, the Obama administration vetoed a resolution calling for implementation of official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy is opposition to expansion of the settlements, which is incidentally a pretty minor issue. It's the settlements that are the problem, not the expansion of them. The settlements are in strict violation of international law. That's been decided by the highest authorities, Security Council, International Court of Justice, practically every country in the world. And the Obama administration actually vetoed a resolution calling for implementation of U.S. opposition to expansion of the settlements. Well, that's what the record's been like. So how do you deal with this problem? It's in our hands. We have the capacity to change U.S. policy. There's not much you can do about the policy of Iran or India or Pakistan, not much. We can do a lot about U.S. policy. That's opportunity again. And it's U.S. policy that is the overwhelming factor in preventing implementation of a settlement. In my view, not a great settlement. I think it leaves many problems unsolved, many problems. But that's true of every diplomatic settlement. Diplomatic settlements are partial. They try to deal with some immediate problems, leaving others to handle later on, okay? So this would be a step forward. It would reduce the cycle of violence. It would open the way to further steps, say various kinds of mutual accommodation, so on and so forth. We could go into it. But it is a step, and it's blocked by U.S. policy. If I have another minute, I could...
Yeah, another minute would be good.
Well, there are a lot of analogies drawn between Israel and South Africa. Most of them, I think, are extremely dubious. But there's one analogy which I think is correct, and it's almost never discussed. It's this. In 1950, we know from internal documents that in 1958, the nationalist government, the apartheid government of South Africa, recognized that it was beginning to become an international pariah. The foreign minister of South Africa called in the American ambassador to discuss it with him and said, in effect, that we're becoming an international pariah, everyone's voting against us in the United Nations, but we know, you and I know, that there's only one vote in the United Nations, yours. The way he put it is, you're the leaders of the free world, meaning you run the world. So the effect is saying, as long as you support us, we don't care if the world's against us. Now, if you look at what happened in the subsequent years, that's pretty much what happened. The U.S. continued to support the nationalist regime within. It supported South African depredations against Angola, Mozambique, which were brutal and murderous. This went on right through the Reagan years. By the end of the Reagan years, the United States was actually the only country that made any difference that was supporting South Africa. And apartheid stayed, right? A couple of years later, the United States did join the world and abandoned support for the apartheid regime, and it collapsed. Now, that was not the only reason, but it was a reason. Now, there's another reason which doesn't, that much carries over, I think, to the Israel-Palestine question. But there was another factor that doctrine in the United States prevents us from attending to, namely Cuba. Cuba played a huge role in the liberation of Africa. Cuba sent soldiers to drive the South African invaders out of Angola. It compelled South Africa to abandon its illegal hold on Namibia. Made it very clear to the South Africans, Cuban force did, that they were not going to be able to establish the kind of regional support system by violence that they hoped to. This, in fact, the Cuban role in liberation of Africa altogether is enormous. And it's pretty remarkable because Cuba never took credit for it. They wanted credit to be taken by the black Africans themselves. So it's a kind of a hidden history, except that it has been exposed in scholarship. Pierre Iglesias has done the main work on this. When Nelson Mandela was finally let out of prison, about his first acts were to praise Cuba and Castro for liberating South Africa. If you go to Pretoria, the capital, there's a monument for the people who died in the struggle against apartheid. lots of Cuban names. They understand. We're not supposed to talk about it. This is among the things that kind of like didn't happen in our doctrinal system. But it happened in the real world. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, there's no Cuba. So the responsibility for our shifting U.S. policy is even greater. And it can be done. I don't think it's finished by any means.
Okay, actually, yeah, I like I'm particularly happy. I was particularly happy to have you answer that question, like, because it's these issues. What's really important is to get out the information to people, and you don't, and you're not allowed in the mainstream media, you individually, and so so the history of the, for example, the votes in the UN, I think it's really important to go into them. So, but this is a question from a young person, because he says he's a young person. And I think it's important. It relates to the question you just asked. So it said, would you please talk about the bonds between conservative America and Israel? I think perhaps my age limits my understanding. What combination of ideology, propaganda, lobbying, and money makes Israel's security such a sacred American cow? A wonderful question, I think.
Well, it's a good question, but and these are important factors. I mean, let's start with what's called conservative support from Israel. First, I think some kind of semantic hygiene is useful. There's really no conservatives in the United States. The people who are called conservatives are radical statists, for the most part. That's very different from... there are a few genuine conservatives, which means something like classical liberals, but not many. What are called if you take a look at what's at the Republican Party today, which is the strongest, extreme support for Israeli policies, they have a popular base. A large part of the popular base is Christian evangelicals. They are passionate supporters of Israeli policies, and they're also extreme anti-Semites. If you take a look at they don't say it, but take a look at the doctrines, like the dispensationalist doctrines. Yeah. They're looking forward to a battle in Armageddon, where everybody gets murdered and the saved souls rise to heaven. What happens to the Jews? Well, according to some of these versions, 160,000 of them find Christ in time and they're saved. The rest are condemned to eternal damnation. How can you be more anti-Semitic than that? And in fact, but their support for Israel is because partly, interpretation of the Bible, interpretation of the book of Revelations, and so on and so forth, which leads them to strongly support Israeli crimes, to the extent that, Israel welcomes the support, but it also tries to control them. Like when they try to blow up the Temple Mount and so on, Israel doesn't think that's a good idea, so they block them. But why is the Republican Party, why does it have a popular base like that? That's part of its popular base. Another part of its popular base is people who are so terrified that they have to have a gun in their pocket when they go into Starbucks to get a cup of coffee. That's something that goes way back in American history. This has always been a very frightened country, and for pretty understandable reasons. From the very beginning, there were real threats from the people we were suppressing. The Indians could fight back. Black slaves might revolt. After the Haitian Revolution, there's a huge fear, so everybody has to have a gun. We have to protect ourselves. And it goes on and on. Well, that's a large part of the base of the Republican Party. Another part is the nativist element. If you look at the demography of the United States, the white population will soon become a minority. The phrase that's used is, they are taking our country away from us. They being all of those bad people. And that's a big part. It's an element in American society. These sectors have been mobilized by the Republicans roughly in the past 20 years for a very good reason. The Republican Party, since about 1995, has stopped being a parliamentary party. It's off the spectrum. They are so dedicated to service to the extreme wealth and corporate power that they cannot get votes by putting forth their own programs. So they've turned to other forms of popular mobilization on what are called, social issues. I mean, should you read the Bible in class? Anti-abortion? Should you prevent blacks from voting? Whatever it may be. That part of the base is strongly pro-Israel. That's one phenomenon, but there's much more than that. APAC, the lobbying organizations, they're important. Sheldon Adelson and the big contributors, they're important. But I think there's much deeper reasons for the unique Israeli support for U.S. support for Israeli policies. And you see it if you look over the history. When did this support develop? I mean, it wasn't true in the 1950s. There was support for Israel, but Eisenhower didn't hesitate to force Israel out of the Sinai right before a presidential election. Most sensitive moment. Just told them, get out or else. Threatened them, they naturally got out. They have to do what the U.S. says. But the big change was in 1967. What happened in 1967? There was a conflict in the Arab world between radical Islam, in Saudi Arabia, and secular nationalism, which meant Egypt. The United States pretty consistently supports radical Islam, just as the British did in the day when they ran the place. Secular nationalism is considered a threat. It might move towards independence, and that is intolerable if you're trying to run the world. Running the world is, for good reasons. You could go into it, but it is intolerable. And radical Islam has been more under control. Well, in 1967, Israel administered a lethal blow to secular nationalism. They smashed Egypt, which was the center of it. Big gift to Saudi Arabia. In fact, there was a war going on at the time between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, a kind of a proxy war in the Yemen, and Israel settled it in favor of Saudi Arabia, the main U.S. ally, the most extreme Islamic radical state, but it's where all the oil is, so that's been the U.S. ally since the 1940s. This was a major gift to the United States and its ally. You take a look, that's when American aid to Israel shot up. In 1970, you may recall, there was the government of Jordan initiated a military campaign against the Palestinians in Jordan, a real massacre. It looked for a while as if Syria might move to protect the Palestinians. The U.S. didn't want that. The U.S. was completely embroiled at that time in Southeast Asia, couldn't do a thing. It asked Israel to mobilize its forces to compel Syria to withdraw. They did, and the U.S. aid to Israel quadrupled that year. And so it continues. There's a very close strategic alliance. It extends to military and intelligence relations, which are very close. So take, say, drone technology. A lot of it's developed in Rafael Industries near Haifa. The main Israeli economy by now relies very heavily on high-tech military production and export in close relationship to the United States. Very recently, a document was released under the Freedom of Information Act demonstrating U.S. participation, tolerance, and participation in Israeli nuclear and other high-tech developments since about the 1960s. It's very close if you look at the details. There's an interesting article by William Greider that just came out about it, describing some of the details. Rafael Industry, the major Israeli military industry, is so closely linked to U.S. military industry that it has actually transferred its management headquarters to Washington, where the money is. In fact, one of the most interesting exposés from WikiLeaks listed high-level strategic locations that the United States ranked as necessary to protect at all costs. One of them was Rafael Military Industries near Haifa. Intelligence connections have been very close for a long time. These are really significant matters, basic reasons for the continuation of the close relationship. There also are cultural issues, no doubt. One is Christianity. I mean, Christian Zionism goes back before Jewish Zionism, and it's very high level. It's not just evangelicals, it's a high level phenomenon. Lord Balfour, Woodrow Wilson, you know.
More evidence that what you believe affects your actions.
It does. I mean, for them, these are Bible, people read the Bible every morning. It's God said that the Jews have to go back to the land, the Palestine, land of Israel. Okay, we've got to do it. This is a strong element in high-level U.S. policy. Then there's the popular base, like evangelical Christianity, mostly incidentally since about 1950. There's another relation which I can't prove. You can think about it. It seems to me possible. The United States is a settler colonial society. That's a special form of imperialism. It's true of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Specific form of imperialism which you don't just rule the colony, like say the British in India, but you eliminate the population and you settle it. Unique form of imperialism. We're a striking example of it. Well, what's Israel? It's a settler colonial society. I suspect that resonates with Americans. They're doing what we did, so it's got to be something right about it, because we did it, you know. I can't.
Okay. There have been a remarkable number of questions. Those were the easy questions. Detailed questions about issues that are from anarchism to the necessity of states to the nature of the American educational system. I wish we could have gotten them, but I did make your wife, Valeria, a promise that I would not. I know you would be here till midnight answering these questions if you could, but you are 86 years old, and I made her a promise that we would end by 10. And I just want to say that the questions are great. The great thing is that Noam continues to write, and the answers to many of these are there if you seek them out. And in an event like this, our intent, and any of the events we run like this, is to interest you in thinking about things, but obviously not answer every question. And I can't think of a more powerful and more amazing opportunity than tonight to think about questions ranging from the human mind to human conduct. And I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank Noam Chomsky for this evening. Thank you very much.